Hi friends, it's that special time again where I make a big old video and people fall asleep to the soothing noises of me screaming and shouting like a little dum-dum about funny space guys who like to scream and shout at each other like little dum-dums. And so, for today's dum-dums, we have the Chaos Space Marines, the main five legions that is, those being the avatars of the four gods and Abaddon's boys. So, I hope everyone enjoys this awesome mega video. Hi, friends. Today we're talking about the poster boys of chaos, the Black Legion. And straight up, these guys and Abaddon are really cool. And if you don't think so, you gotta read less memes. Which also might seem heretical coming from Acadia simps such as myself. But you know what they say you're only as good as your villain. So let's talk about the largest force of Space Marines and one of the biggest, if not the biggest, threats of the Imperium, the Black Legion. The Black Legion was forged from the remnants of the Sons of Horus and any warrior willing to follow Abaddon the Despoiler's path of vengeance and destruction. And while the Black Legion is technically a successor of the Sons of Horus, they're more their own thing and hardly share anything with the Sons of Horus in the present time. Which is also why I'm going to make a separate Sons of Horus video somewhere down the line. But anyways, at the Siege of Terra, after Horus was destroyed by the Emperor, the Sons of Horus fell into disarray and were utterly demoralized by the death of their Primarch. So they routed and abandoned the other Chaos Legions present at the battle to be crushed by the Loyalist forces. And after retreating to the warp, recovering Horus's corpse, and recouping on the dead world of Malium, the Sons of Horus would conduct raids against the Imperium to get revenge and attempt to reassert themselves as the leaders of the traitors. Additionally, the remaining traitor forces would soon fall to anarchy and break into disparate warbands, beginning the Legion Wars, where they would fight each other in the warp for dominance, supplies, and just for the funsies. And in this time, the first captain of the Sons of Horus, Abaddon, would abandon his legion, mourning the death of his father, and was disgusted by what the once powerful legions had become. So, Abaddon wandered the Eye of Terror, learning more about the nature of chaos and deciding what he wanted to do in his life. So he's like 80% of people after graduating. Meanwhile, the remaining Sons of Horus were getting whittled down by demonic hordes, rival warband raids, and rampant possessions. Then, one day, the Emperor's children, headed by Fabius Bile, sieged the Sons of Horus' fortress and stole the corpse of Horus. This raid left the Sons of Horus near annihilation and demoralized with the loss of their daddy's corpse. They began fighting each other in their angst, and many had little murder tantrums. And to make matters worse, Fabius Bile attempted to make ghoulish clones of Horus to aid the forces of Slanesh. All the while, Abaddon observed the Sons of Horus' pitiful defeat and pathetic tantrums. He returned to his legion, sickened by their decline, and he spent days in Horus' tomb. And his mourning turned to hatred as he realized Horus' failures and arrogance led to the pathetic state that his legion was wallowing in. So, Abaddon killed all the remaining Sons of Horus captains and commanded the legionnaires to swear fealty to him and only him. Few resisted Abaddon's dominions, and those who did were hunted down and brutally killed. And so, with his legion mostly reunified, Abaddon paid the Emperor's children a little visit. He killed all the failed Horus clones on his trail to finding Bile until he finally came across the prime Horus clone, the one closest to the true Horus. Abaddon killed the soulless mockery of his Primarch and declared that he was no longer his son. And with the death of the clone came the death of the Sons of Horus, and from its remains, Abaddon would forge the Black Legion. Abaddon was just as disgusted with the other traitor legions' declines as he was with his former legions. And even more so, he was disgusted with many of the traitor primarchs giving into chaos and falling to demonhood. Abaddon felt that falling to the temptations of chaos was to become a slave to them, and that was his father's folly. So, he took it upon himself to unify the traitor forces once more to succeed where Horus had failed. Abaddon would destroy the Imperium and gain dominion of humanity at all costs. But first, he would need to build his Black Legion. Abaddon carved a bloody warpath against all who opposed him, and the conquests that he waged gained him infamy across the Imperium and the Warp. And through inspiration, fear, respect, or all of the above, more and more warriors across the warp joined Abaddon's Black Legion. Rival warlords would fall to Abaddon's claw, slaves cowered before him, and demons and beasts joined his ranks to satiate their bloodlust. Marines from across the legions would scorch their armor black and swear loyalty to Abaddon. And despite his growing ranks, Abaddon knew that truly united chaos was a fool's errand, but he sought to at least direct their endless slaughter towards his goals of ruin. He accepted all warriors as long as they swore allegiance to him, and he allowed the annexed warbands freedom to pursue their own conquest as long as it brought pain to the Imperium. Although technically one legion, the Black Legion is more like an alliance between many warbands. They often fight apart from one another, sowing chaos in their own ways, and although they mostly fight independently, they still swear complete allegiance to Abaddon. Abaddon has also got an inner circle of trusted generals to help him assert his dominion over the huge legion. But despite all that, sometimes, on very special occasions, they join hand in hand for a very special Black Crusade. The Black Crusades are usually humongous chaos attacks where Abaddon manages to rein in the majority of his legion for a mostly focused campaign. Thus far, there have been 13, and each set out to complete a step of Abaddon's evil master scheme. And here, it might be a good spot to talk about something very important. A lot of people like to clown on Abaddon and his Black Crusades. Even I'm guilty of it since, it's fun to make fun of your guy's main enemy. But each Black Crusade is a legitimately apocalyptic level threat to the Imperium, and Abaddon is actually quite a cool character and a competent enemy. Heresy, I know. How could Mr. Cadia Simp say such things? But as I said before, you're only as good as your villain, and if the Cadian's arch nemesis was a armless wet noodle with a small wiener, that last part may be true because, he's a space marine, then they aren't really that badass for fending him off for 10,000 years. Unfortunately, Abaddon suffers hard from meme lore. And I get it, most people are Imperial players because Imperium is the best, and it's fun to make fun of your rival faction. But too many people don't realize that these jokes and teases are just that, jokes. And Abaddon is legitimately terrifying and one of the few Chaos leaders whose whole legion isn't completely stupid-pilled into constant Starscream-esque backstabbing and infighting. Like, they're still kinda stupid, don't get me wrong, but they're just not completely stupid. In addition, Abaddon is a legitimately interesting fella. He abhors Chaos corruption and is the only character in the setting to actually utilize Chaos's powers without selling his soul. At least for now. But he doesn't do this with ease. He has to constantly pull strings and remain vigilant to the temptations of Chaos. Like in the Fall of Cadia, he had to constantly keep tabs on his forces to make sure he wasn't pleasing any one god too much. He would constantly alter his war plans to keep the respective gods at bay. He is also somewhat of a tragic figure because despite all his efforts and rage, he's still destined to wage an endless war, as is the nature of the 40k setting. I'm just saying, it's okay to not like Abaddon for whatever reason, but if you think he's a useless buffoon, you're just objectively wrong lore-wise. He is always treated like a walking apocalypse in-universe. He is widely feared by his enemies and is the leader of the largest unified force of Chaos, which, for a thing called Chaos, is no small feat. Also, the only reason we, quote, only see him lose, which isn't even true, is because we've only ever seen the climax of his attacks where he's foiled after destroying a shitload of his enemies. It's like the Tyranid effect. They'll completely destroy a ton of worlds, but we'll only see the battle where they're finally stopped. Abaddon going around crushing a ton of worlds simply isn't a good narrative for a novel. But all that being said, fuck Abaddon, he's an armless jerk and destroyed my favorite planet. It shouldn't die a baby dumb. Anyways though, back to the Black Legion, one of the coolest aspects to me is the fact that it's a conglomeration of the forces of Chaos. This means you can soup Marines from a wide variety of legions, as well as non-Marine forces like demons and mutants into a single army. I don't know if 10th edition killed this or not, but even so, the point still stands is you still have a ton of homebrew freedom. They're kind of like a huge Chaos Death Watch, taking Marines from a bunch of legions, painting their armor black, and kicking ass. Expanding on the union of various Chaos forces, though, each one of the main traitor legions has a warband within the Black Legion. The Hounds of Abaddon are former World Eaters, Children of Torment are Emperor's Children, Bringers of Decay are Death Guard, and the Sons of the Cyclops are, of course, Thousand Sons. Furthermore, he utilizes specialists of other legions such as Iron Warrior Warpsmiths, Wordbearer Possessed, and Alpha Legion Infiltrators. Also, funnily enough, there was a pretty prominent warband of the Dark Angels Fallen called the Lost Lions. I just thought that was interesting because, we're Dark Angels, we're totally lions. And currently the Black Legion are doing what they do, sowing chaos, gathering warriors and artifacts, and fighting whoever comes in their way. Notably, Abaddon forged, pun intended, an alliance with Vashtor and led his Arcs of Omen campaign. But anyways, that's pretty much all I gotta say for today. And I quite like the Black Legion. They're a great catch-all villain legion, are probably my third favorite after the World Eaters and Thousand Sons. I'll just always really like the idea of an army made up of a bunch of legions working together. For example, I really like Miniscape's Chaos Force. All the different legions looked real cool together. And here, look how cool they look in Codex Eye of Terror. Ooh, it just makes you want to get a bunch of overpriced, out-of-production models. And overall, like I said, I think they get too much hate. Like, Abaddon isn't my favorite character, but he's a cool villain and his legion is fun. And honestly, it's probably mostly people hating on poster boy factions, which I suppose is somewhat understandable, if not misguided. But let me know what you think of the Black Legion and why you hate Abaddon the Despoiler. I'm gonna make some separate videos for Abaddon, the Sons of Horus, and probably even the Black Crusades in the future, but for now, that's been the Black Legion. Also, Ezekiel Abaddon almost sounds like Easy Kyle, especially when people mispronounce it, which sounds like some kind of cool cowboy dude who drinks whiskey and likes to party or something. Hi friends, today we're going to talk about, honestly, one of the best villain legions in the entire setting. So, turn your brains off, grab your axe, prepare your world appetite, and go crazy style, because today we're talking about the World Eaters. The World Eaters are the 12th Legion and Sons of Angron. After turning traitor, the World Eaters became the Legion of Khorne, God of War. But before meeting their angry dad, the 12th Legion was one of the most, if not the most aggressive and brutal legions of the Unification Wars. Their bloodlust and savage efficiency made them excellent shock troops and earned them the name of the Emperor's Warhounds. Despite their eagerness and brutality, or perhaps because of their eagerness and brutality, they were used sparingly in the early Unification Wars. But they're finally allowed to be unleashed in full force on a literal world called Cerberus. The people of Cerberus started a rebellion, and unfortunately, this isn't Star Wars, so the rebels aren't the main characters. So, with most other legions across the galaxy, the Warhounds were summoned to the world. And in just 5 hours, the entire rebellion was brutally murdered by the Warhounds. After this, the Warhounds would continue to be used as shock troops and murder death balls, and they would also become infamous for their brutality and reckless abandon. The Warhounds only cared to kill as much as they could. This would often lead to high casualties on both sides, as the Warhounds would put themselves in dangerous positions and also rack up more team kills than a Helldiver with an arc gun. Which, you might think, Warhounds were kinda dummies then. Anyways, while the Warhounds were out having fun, brutally murdering everything, Angron was not having fun, brutally murdering everything. Anyways, Angron had landed on the world of Nuceria as a wee little baby, and as a wee little baby, he somehow murdered a squad of Eldar, which impressed the Nucerian slavers so much when they found him that they made him a gladiator for their super space gladiatorial arenas. In the arenas, baby Ron proved himself, and the slavers tried to enhance him further with cybernetics and sci-fi surgical jazz, but since he was a magic space baby, they were largely unable to. But, luckily for them, apparently not even a Primarch is able to resist the awesome power of Cranon Brain Make Dum Dum style. More accurately, it would be Nail in Brain Make Dum Dum style, as Angron had the Butcher nails implanted in his noggin. The Butcher's nails were a piece of ancient Nucerian tech that basically lobotomized the subject and made them extremely angry, only able to think about being angry and only deriving anger from Only deriving anger from anger, what the fuck? What I meant to say was they could only derive pleasure from brutally murdering things or being angry. And thus, after getting the nails put in, Angron turned to the camera and he said, I am Angry Ron! And so, after getting the nails put in, Angron would become even more deadly, and he became the greatest gladiator of the pits and would eventually lead a gladiator rebellion. The gladiators killed their slavers, razed their cities, and eventually became known as the Eaters of Cities. Unfortunately for Angron, though, at the final battle, he was rescued by the Emperor. Now, to any rational person, this might seem like a good thing, but this rescue led to all of Angron's besties getting killed by the overlords. Plus, Angron was so murder-kill brain at this point, he didn't care for his life and only wanted to either free his friends or die in glorious combat. Also, though, people criticize the Emperor for saving Angron, and while I agree that the Emperor didn't do the best he could, I don't think it's nearly as bad as people make it out to be. Angron and pals were literally starving and dying from the cold mountains, so Angron basically had no chance of winning. And on the flip side, if the Emperor did go down and help Angron with his little battle, it's very likely that Angron would still resent the Emperor due to stealing his glory or honor or some other dumb thing, kind of similar to Mortarion. And if Angron and pals somehow did magically win, lobotomy victims with nails in their brains aren't exactly known for their administrational prowess, so. But with that being said, the Emperor could have at least said sorry to Angry Ronald, but also keep in mind, Angron literally had brain damage, so I'm sure he would have been mad either way. Anyways, Angron resented the Emperor. He never talked to him beyond what was necessary. He never considered the other Primarchs his brothers or even friends, and he hated the War Dogs Legion since they weren't like his old friend group. So, once reunited with his sons, the Warhounds, they were super happy to see their angry dad. But, big plot twist incoming, Angron was angry and he killed any Legionnaire that tried to give good old dad a hug. Angron being angry, who would have guessed? The only person who was able to talk to Angron without getting killed was the legendary Karn. After Angron kicked the shit out of him for a while, Karn somehow convinced Angron to lead the Warhounds as he refused to fight back, and he convinced Angron that having an army of space marines who idolize you is pretty cool actually, and he could probably kill like a whole lot of dudes. So, Angron begrudgingly took command of the Legion, and he would rename the Warhounds the World Eaters to honor his lost friends. Which also, fun fact, the iconic bunny ear things also came from Nucerian gladiatorial tradition, as the most bloodthirsty and insane gladiators would wear a headdress similar to this. But anyways, despite the parental abuse, the World Eater Legion idolized their Primarch, hailing him as the War Messiah, which, also, another aside, War Messiah is honestly an underrated 40k title. It's just metal as hell. Anyways, though, the Legionnaires believed Angron to be the perfect warrior and they aspired to be just like him. Angron would go on to prove that, perfect warrior or not, he was most certainly not the perfect leader. And in fact, he might even be the perfect worst commander of all time. Angron discarded all of the Warhound traditions and replaced it with the brutal gladiatorial customs of Nuceria. In addition, he would order his sons to implant the butcher's nails like he and his gladiatorial pally pals did once before. Unfortunately, though, Angron was no brain surgeon, and apparently neither were any of his staff because the operation had a very modest 0% rate at first. That's right, 0. Everybody died. But after killing a bunch of his own men, he finally brute forced his way through learning how to non-lethally stick a bunch of nails in your brain when Karn was the first Legionnaire to survive the operation. Despite all this though, Angron still hated his sons and was still an asshole to them because they weren't cool like his old pals were, and he would make them complete planetary conquests in 31 hours because that was the length of a Nucerian day and it was how long it took him and his pals to take over a city. Which, if you're paying attention, there's a little issue there. He gave his sons the near impossible quota of taking over an entire world because it was cool when him and his friends took over a single city that one time. So, when the World Eaters inevitably failed, he would decimate their ranks. In this case, decimate as in minus a tenth. However, this isn't a total case of Angron just being stupid. It's a case of him being a dick. He knew that it was a stupid time limit, but he wanted every excuse he could possibly get to kill the sons that were forced upon him. What a guy! He also abandoned his sons for 2 years to find some fight milk and death sticks, but giving his sons 2 years without him was probably one of the nicer things he did for them, so yippee, I guess. Anyways, though, the combination of the World Eater's literally brain dead tactics, reckless fighting style, and brutal leadership meant that the apothecaries had to use experimental and dangerous tech on World Eater aspirants to keep their numbers manageable. However, this brutality did make the World Eaters some of the best, if not the best melee combatants in the era, and also earned them a lot of infamy. And due to this brutality, eventually Angron was banished to the fringes of the galaxy by the Emperor due to his constant team killing and overly murderific campaigns. Which, considering the Imperium's track record, is saying a lot. But banishing Angron away from an empire he hates to a place where he can murder even harder with less supervision is like sending a fat kid to Candyland jail, famous for their formidable candy bars. And so, this would prove to be yet another mistake in the game of handling Angron, as when Horus decided a heresy, he was easily able to sway Angron to his cause. And I imagine it went a little something like this. And greetings to you too, Angron. I came all this way to introduce you to the magnificent power of. Okay, yeah, fine. You convinced me. Let's go kill the Emperor now. And so, now as the evil, diabolical traitor legion, the World Eaters, well, they basically did the same shit that they did before. Killing things and being angry and such, yada yada. Except this time, they were able to be even bigger jerks than before. They participated in the drop site massacre, culled their loyalist World Eaters, then they killed some more, Angron got turned into a demon prince while fighting Gilliman, killed some more dudes on Terra, and they had an angry time the whole way through. After getting beat on Terra, though, the traitors mostly splintered and Angron mostly disappeared once more. Sometime later, though, the World Eaters would come across the planet now known as Scalathrax. And on this world, they encountered some Emperor's children, and the two legions fought over who owned this useless frozen wasteland because, Kaz is stupid and all. And eventually, after a lot of fighting, the two legions would be forced to momentarily cease their fighting due to the extreme cold that was even too much for Astartes to handle, so they took a little snack break to prepare to fight again. Which also, maybe the wife beater pattern Astartes armor wasn't the best idea, fellas, just saying. However, during their little break, Karn was extremely angry, of course, that his brothers were sitting inside not dying instead of dying outside, so he set a fire in their ass to rekindle the battle. Oh wait, he literally did this? With the flamer, huh? What an asshole! But yeah, he literally took a flamer and immolated his brothers to inspire them to get back into the battle. And it worked! They fought the Emperor's children as well as each other. And they won! Won nothing at all. Both sides took heavy casualties and gained basically nothing. But this brazen move earned Karn his the Betrayer moniker, and also forever broke his legion. So now, in the present time, the World Eaters have only become angrier, more angry, and more prone to anger. Thanks to the Butcher's Nails, the World Eaters can only feel pleasure in battle and can only feel peace in death. They roam the galaxy, destroying and killing anything in their path. They've also ditched their cool blue and white scheme for a red scheme to both honor their god and so that they don't have to do laundry anymore. That part's real. They're so dedicated to the gamer grind that they hardly clean themselves since they're too busy killing things and wanting to kill things. And this is usually about where I talk about the chapter's fighting style and stuff, but it should be really quite clear. The World Eaters love nothing more than getting into the thick of it and thinning it. And that's to say, killing literally everything in sight, often with the chain axe, but even more often they don't really care as long as they're spilling blood. And also, interestingly enough, the World Eaters actually do retain their intellect despite the nails, which many people seem to not know or forget, probably because they usually act like morons. But, anyways, they are relatively as smart as other Marines. It's just that their minds are so clouded with anger that they can't or won't choose any tactic beyond run in and kill thing. So they basically have murder ADHD, or MADHD, as I newly named it. Anyways, though, throughout this video, it may have seemed like I don't like the World Eaters, but that would be wrong. I actually like them quite a bit. But unlike a lot of people, I don't actually like them for the tragedy of the Legion or because I think Angron is such a sympathetic guy. I actually think Angron's kind of a dumb asshole most of the time. But I just think that the World Eaters are a perfect villain legion. Big, red, angry fellas who destroy everything in sight is just such a perfect heel in the world of 40k. Even just the imagery of a corn berserker and their bold red swinging their humongo axes is really damn cool. And Demon Angron perfectly fits the archetypical demon look. Yeah, it's sad and tragic that Angron got the nails and it gave him a case of the mad, but like at every single turn, he does the dumbest or jerkiest thing possible. He is the worst case of a self destructive fella who perpetuates his trauma to those who admire him. Yes, it's sad that he was constantly having his agency taken away from him, but the few times he did have agency, he would just hurt others or choose to become even more of a slave than ever by siding with chaos. Plus, he retained his intelligence and stuff even if he had the anger nails, so he was still cautiously choosing to do the things that he did. Trauma is not a valid excuse to the horrible things that Angron did. The real tragedy of Angron is that he lost the will to not be a stupid asshole. Or maybe I just haven't read enough Angron stories. If any Angron stands have any big recommendations, please comment them for me to check out. It's just that the more books I read about Angron, the less I like him, which is kind of weird because usually in 40k, the more I read about a faction or character, the more I like him. So Angron's a very special little boy in that regard. But anyways, that's the World Eaters. Again, I think they're a really excellent villain faction. Even their dumb, stupid brain tactics are cool. Their Megatron pilled mindset of destroy everything stupid style is really fun to see. And on a deeper level, the struggle of the Butcher's Nails is pretty compelling in some cases. Even though I don't like Angron much, I still think his story is interesting and Karn is also very cool. But let me know what you think about the World Eaters and why I'm wrong and how Angron is actually the nicest, most sympathetic guy in the entire world. Yippee! Or let me know how much World Eater rage you have that I didn't mention Lotara Sard until now. World Eaters, Yet they've never eaten a world. How peculiar. Yeah, they're no Unicron, that's for sure. Hi, friends. If you're a big fan of debauchery, degeneracy, or the color purple, then let out a big old Doom Rider screech, because this is the video for you. Today, we're talking about perhaps the most depraved Space Marine Legion of them all, the Emperor's Children. These Marines are the main legionary force of the God of Excess Slanesh, which means there's going to be an excessive amount of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as well as excessive perfectionism to a appropriately grim dark degree. The Emperor's Children were the third founding legion, and their first aspirants came from the noble houses of Europa after they were defeated by the Thunder Warriors. The legion was nicknamed the Emperor's Children and were defined by their perfection, nobility, and the fact that they were willing to lead the Emperor's mortal armies in the early days of the Unification Wars. Most other legions were too elitist or too uppity to work alongside regular human soldiers in this way. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor's Children's stellar record and efficiency meant that the Emperor assigned them important missions, and they're colloquially known as his heralds. This is also where their purple armor originated, as it was meant to signify their royal duties. In addition to the purple, they also bear the Palatine Aquila. Now, this may not seem like a big deal in 40k since everyone and their mom wears the Aquila, but in the Great Crusade era, the Emperor's Children were the only legion allowed to wear it after they saved the Emperor in the Proximan betrayal, and they bore the icon to signify the Emperor's appreciation and reverence of the chapter. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. These purple fellows were struck with tragedy when everyone's favorite Skelly boy stole a ton of the Emperor's children's gene seed, and to make matters worse, their gene seed on Terra got infected with the Blight, which caused the Marines with the seed to experience rapid organ failure. The Emperor's children culled the infected in order to save the Legion, but they were ravaged and only had 200 Marines left. Luckily for them, however, they would meet their fabulous Primarch Fulgrim on the mining planet of Chemos. Like his legion, Fulgrim strove for perfection in all things and was a master duelist and smith. He brought his planet of Chemos to prosperity with his technical know-how and political acumen. He went from a humble laborer to a ruling executive. He made the planet so darn efficient that the Chemosians made Fulgrim their glorious leader. Fulgrim also had a number of political marriages, so you know what that means. Gulp. Upon reuniting with his sons, he gave a rousing speech that was so inspirational that the Emperor officially named his legion the Emperor's Children. So, with his sons, he further reinforced the perfection they strove for in order to honor the Emperor, and this was doubly important since they were so few. He also became enamored with the art since Chemos was a drab, boring planet. He taught his legion to appreciate the beautiful works of humanity, how to be more perfect duelists, and his skin and hair routine so that they would all be hotties. At first, the Legion was too small to do their own operations, so they had to work alongside the Luna Wolves while their numbers were rebuilt. Here, fighting alongside his brother, Fulgrim grew very close to Horus and highly respected him. Eventually, Fulgrim would get enough Marines to lead his own campaigns, and he split after Horus became War Master. In his crusades, Fulgrim constantly sought to improve and become more and more perfect. He would often flaunt and test his legion's perfection by doing wacko strategies. For example, one time he took over an entire planet with just 7 of his legionaries, which, even for a Primarch, is very nutty. Then, another one of Fulgrim's besties was Ferrus Manus. Both of the Primarchs sought to perfect themselves in their legions and bonded over their ideals. To signify their friendship, they gifted each other a master-crafted weapon, Fulgrim making the Warhammer Forgebreaker and Ferrus crafting the Fireblade. So, off to crusading they went. Under Fulgrim's command, the Emperor's children became renowned once more as one of the most efficient and threatening legions. But one fateful day, they were sent to conquer the world of Laren. The Layers of Laren were a snake-like Xenos species that, just like the Emperor's children, sought to perfect themselves. But they went further than just simple training. These snake boys would genetically modify their bodies and use chemical stimulants to suit whatever battlefield role they needed. This, in combination with their advanced tech, made them a formidable foe, and thus, Fulgrim's perfect legion was sent to exterminate them. The Administratum estimated that extermination would take decades to complete, but the Emperor's children are too perfect and too fabulous to play with snakes for that long, and they genocided the layer in just a month. Although they took heavy casualties, this was still an insane feat from the Purple Boys. But this victory would be a defining moment for the Legion as Fulgrim claimed the Layer Blade as a prize and Fabius Bile took an interest in the biological experimentation the Layer practiced. Later on, it would be recognized that the Layer were in fact Slaaneshi worshippers and the Layer Blade was a demon sword. But that will be more important later on. It was also after this battle that the famous Noise Marines found their origin when a remembrancer created a symphony called Maravilha, or as the cool kids call it, Margaritaville. This song was so wicked rad and infused with Slaaneshi energies that the audience started an orgy of both the sex and murder variety. The frequencies produced from the instruments were also said to be fatal and would serve as the basis to the Noise Marines' weaponry. More on them later, though. Another notable encounter was on the world of Tarsus, where Fulgrim met the legendary Eldrad Ulthwé. Eldrad foresaw Horus's heresy, which would fester from a fateful wound he received on Anathame. Fulgrim didn't like Eldrad dissing his homeboy and attacked the silly elf. He ended up killing a Wraith Lord, Avatar of Cain, and a ton of other elf guys. Afterwards, he also virus bombed a few Eldar Maiden worlds just to make sure they learned not to accuse Mr. Horus Heresy of any Horus Heresy-ing. Although he didn't believe the elf, Fulgrim went to confront Horus about his potential heresy, but he eventually got persuaded to join Horus. Hey! I heard from some elf guy that you're a heretic now. Tell me this isn't true. I hate heretics. Oh, hello, Fulgrim. Looking good. Yes, I know. I always do. Listen, I might be a heretic now, and I know you said you hate heretics, but okay, you convinced me. Let's kill the Emperor. Oh, really? Sweet, let's do it. Fulgrim wasn't actually swayed as easily as I made it sound, but his respect for Horus and manipulation from his very special sinister silver sword allowed the once zealously loyal Fulgrim to be corrupted, and he decided that the Emperor was actually hindering the perfection that humanity could achieve. After being convinced, Fulgrim tried to convince his bestie Ferris to also join Team Heresy, but Ferris was not so easily swayed and fought his former bestie. The two would meet again on Isfahan 5 and would engage in their final duel. Using the weapons that were once a sign of friendship and brotherhood, the besties clashed. Both weapons were shattered, that's called symbolism, but Fulgrim eventually emerged victorious thanks to the Layer Blade. With Ferris defeated, Fulgrim could not bring himself to kill his brother. But, luckily, the demon within the blade helped him out there. The demon possessed Fulgrim and beheaded Mr. Iron Hands. Then, Fulgrim had a bit of post-cut clarity, and he was horrified at the demon's actions, but not horrified enough to not let the demon within wholly possess his body and soul. Fulgrim would eventually exorcise the demon from himself, but at that point he decided he liked being an insane demon man, and basically did the same shit he did as a possessed insano, and he devoted himself to Slaanesh. Sometime later, Fulgrim completed a ritual to ascend to demonhood fully, and became the snaky demon Primarch we all know and, I guess some love. In his demon form, he was a near unstoppable force, wielding 4 arms, an agile snake body, big old demon wings, and possessing powerful psyker powers. By the Siege of Terra, the Emperor's children had all but abandoned their nobility and love for humanity. They only sought perfection and captured human slaves for the experiments needed to achieve their sinister goals. After the heresy, the Emperor's children splintered into war bands, continued their experiments, and became raiders to gather supplies and subjects. Although they had long abandoned their nobility and oaths, the children clung on to the pursuit of perfection. Their endless pursuit of perfection already made them the perfect legion for the god of excess, but once devoting themselves to Slaanesh, they took it to the absolute excessive extreme, and they found new and innovative forms of degeneracy. They fell to debauchery, creating powerful stimulants from their victims, slaughtering worlds in increasingly depraved ways, and seeking pleasure in the form of combat, drugs, and whatever else a silly pink marine might like. And also, quick aside here, a lot of people think that the Emperor's children and Slaanesh in general are just a sex faction. Haha, sex! But Marines don't actually care about that, and most of the time they get their thrills from drugs, murder, and torture. Slaaneshi cultists probably like getting down, but not really Marines. They're certainly outliers, but it's not the entire faction. Anyways, using his findings on Laren, Fabius Bile tried to create genetically perfect Marines through genetic trickery and biological augmentation. He also became the leader of the Legion after Fulgrim supposedly fucked off to some hooker planet gifted by Slaanesh. But despite potentially different agendas, most Emperor's children became wholly possessed by their pursuit of perfection and went insane trying to achieve it. For a little bit after the heresy, the Emperor's children partook in a little civil war with the other Chaos Legions, using the conflict to experiment on enemy forces and then eventually on their own fellows Emperor's children. But Abaddon eventually mostly united the Chaos Legions, at least as unified a force called Chaos could possibly be. Then, afterwards, Eidolon sought to unify his legion and used his pillaged loyalist gene seed to recreate the Emperor's children gene seed and strengthen his legion to its former glory. So then, in the current time, the Emperor's children are one of the scariest foes to face since they'll do a lot more than just kill you. They specialize in terror raids and have some of the most skilled duelists, if not the most skilled duelists around. And the best of these duelists are called the Flawless Blades, and they serve as the champions of the Legion and were born of the remnants of the Palatine Blades of the Great Crusade. These dudes are masters with the blade and use combat stims to further their combat efficiency. They're said to have the perfect body for combat due to blessings from Slaanesh. You call them blessings, I call them being fuck ugly. Another special unit that were previously mentioned are the Noise Marines, and these dudes are some of the coolest things in 40k period. They really call back to the early days of GW just throwing whatever cool stuff was popular at the time into the best setting ever. These glam rock, drugged up wackos go around performing the ancient song of Slaanesh to honor their god and slay their foes. This song was made by the Eldar and is said to be the final straw in birthing the god of excess. So now the Noise Marines sing this song to be one with their god and spread its influence. These Marines are heavily mutated and they use a cacophony of sonic weapons that bring great pleasure to themselves while literally killing their enemies with the power of satanic rock and roll. They can also make warp screams to further disorient their foes before the kill. But with that, overall, the Emperor's Children are a very cool faction. Admittedly, they've never been my favorite, but I understand the appeal of playing one of the most debaucherous and one of the most grim factions in a grimdark setting like 40k. Plus, the tragedy of their impossible goal of achieving perfection, causing the decline from noble protectors of humanity who were aspirational heroes into the horrifying sodomites, is quite fascinating, and I feel it demonstrates how one might follow Slanesh. I think it's also a bit sad that many just think that the Emperor's Children are the teehee sex faction, since them being the epitome of self destructive perfectionism and excess is a lot more interesting. These fellas are extra in every single field. They get excessively obsessed with being the perfect warrior, they get excessively obsessed with getting the perfect body, they get excessively obsessed with executing the perfect raid, and so on. I think this is a much more interesting and sympathetic path to Slanesh than simple goonin'. In a creative hobby like 40k, I think most of us can relate to trying to paint the perfect model or creating the perfect list. But at the end of the day, you just gotta realize that sometimes good is good enough, and trying to achieve perfection will turn you into a gross, ugly mutant pinhead Larry who thinks he's hot. And of all the legions, they perhaps had the hardest fall, from noble protectors and artists who were mega devoted to the Emperor and humanity, to the most depraved psychos who sacrificed it all for their own selfish, fanatical obsessions. The fact that they retain the Emperor's Children moniker is also fascinating, as they represent the monsters that the Emperor inadvertently created with his own obsession to his impossible ambitions. But anyways, I'll make another video in the future discussing iconic characters like Fabius Bile, everyone's favorite Emperor's Child ever, Lucius the Eternal, and everyone's actual favorite Emperor's Child ever, Rylanor the Unyielding. But for now, that's been the Emperor's Children. I really love the new Emperor's Children models, especially Lucius. Like, his stupid lizard face is just perfect. But I wish they didn't take away his iconic leg faces. Hi friends, today we're talking about everyone's favorite stinky doo-doo heads, the Death Guard. And I feel like the Death Guard is like everyone's favorite Chaos Legion now. Is it because of their lore, their sick as hell models, or is it just that they're relatable to the average 40k fan? Just kidding, of course. Except for that one guy we all know who definitely needs a shower. But whatever it is, let's find out today. The Death Guard were the 14th Legion and were originally known as the Dusk Raiders. The original Marines of the 14th were made from warlike clans of Albia and were feared in the early Unification Wars for their namesake tactic of launching huge raids at dusk. Wait, raids at dusk? But anyways, these Dusk Raiders were experts in attrition warfare and defense, heavily utilizing heavy infantry, infantry that was presumably even heavier than the walking tanks that Space Marines already are, but, you know. And this emphasis on resilience and heavy infantry would coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, align exactly with their gene father Mortarian's fighting preferences. Which, speaking of, while his sons were dusk raiding and such, Mortarian landed on a poopy shit planet with a poopy shit atmosphere. Baby Mortarian landed on the death world of Barbarous. Barbarous was a horrible mountainous world with a blanket of thick, toxic fog that was deadly to all life on the planet except for the Xeno, but also maybe not Xeno, necromancer overlords that subjugated the people of Barbarous and conducted evil-ass experiments and such. So, the people of Barbarous toiled away in the valleys beneath the fog and were constantly raided and abducted by the overlords. The young Primarch had landed in the middle of a live battle, and his cries were noticed by the greatest warlord on Barbarous, and also, I'm not sure if you know, but babies are usually pathetic little weaklings, so the fact that this little tiny baby guy was able to breathe, let alone cry in the toxic fog, demonstrated great strength and potential, so the warlord adopted the Primarch and named him Mortarian, Child of Death. And so the warlord Nasser took the bear Mortarian out of the toxic air into his lair, and in his evil-ass billionaire mansion on the hill, he taught Mortarian to emulate his flair for battle. All the while, Mortarian was unaware of the toils of humanity in the valleys over there. Listening to that, wow, that was obnoxious. Let's never rhyme again. But anyways, long story short, Mortarian was trained by his father to fight in his armies against the other warlords, and then one day Mortarian decided that his dad asshole and he hates.
Listen, Dad, I'm a smart fella, and you're a fart smella, so I'm out of here.
So he went to the valley to check out the little guys, and he realized that the losers that the overlords had subjugated were actually humans, just like him. And realizing his life was a lie, Mortarion said, "It's over, lords!" and swore vengeance on the overlords. And first, since he was a ugly hillbilly, Mortarion had to win the trust of the people. So he helped the village and built friendships, just like Animal Crossing. He also became besties with a young lad called Callus Typhon, who will certainly never do Morty any harm ever. Anyways, though, after earning the trust of the people, Mortarion trained them to defend themselves and eventually go on the offense and hunt down the overlords. Mortarion was the first human to ever kill an overlord, and he wouldn't stop at one. And eventually, after many years and hundreds of battles, Morty and his elite unit called the Death Guard, wait, is that a 40k reference? Hunted down all but one overlord, Morty's father Nasser. And as Morty made preparations for the final confrontation, some mysterious and hot stranger made acquaintance with the village elders, and it really pissed off Morty that he was getting glory cucked, so he confronted the man. The stranger challenged Mortarion to single-handedly slay the warlord, or swear fealty to the stranger. And thus, Mortarion was put in between a stud and a smelly place. He was not yet ready to kill the warlord, but if he didn't go now, the stranger would likely steal his glory and win the admiration of Barbarous, overshadowing all the work that Mortarion had done over the years. So, one way or another, Mortarion would have to face his father. And so, Mortarion began his ascent to the peak, and near the top his armor had corroded, his respirator shot, and he fell gasping for air right before his adopted father. Nasser went to slay his wayward son, but the stranger emerged and easily one-shot the overlord, saving Mortarion but also damning him to lifelong bitter assholeness. When recovered, Mortarion kept his promise and swore allegiance to the stranger. In that moment, the stranger revealed himself to be the Emperor of mankind and Mortarion's true father. He reunited Mort with his legion and had him fight for the Imperium. And although Mortarion pledged loyalty to the Emperor, much like an immortal grapefruit, he would be forever bitter and resent the Emperor for stealing his kill and trivializing his accomplishments on Barbarous, along with being a humongo tyrant just like his old father. Which, honestly, kind of fair. Imagine you want to be like the high school football captain or something. You're not only extremely talented, but you also spend a ton of time working hard to get better and win the admiration of your teammates, and right before you get the position, some long tan and handsome Superman comes to your school, accomplishes your goal in like 7 seconds with literally no issues at all, steals your thunder, kicks your ribs, steals your girlfriend, poisons your water supply, and is also your dad. Yeah, I think I'd be a little bit angry too, actually. But anyways, Mortarion told his sons that they were his unbroken blades and his death guard, in honor of his warriors on Barbarous. And Bestie Typhon was also made a Marine and eventually first captain of the Death Guard. Reunited, Mortarion taught his boyos his way of warfare, further training their resilience and survival skills. He would also build a resistance to poisons and venoms, Dread Pirate style, in his Marines, and one tradition was him sharing a drink with favored Marines. This was both an honor and a test, as the drink wasn't your normal appy juice. It was a strange brew of the worst poisons and yuckies from Barbarous, and would push the Marines' transhuman immune system to the max, sometimes even knocking out or outright killing the Marines. But those who downed it were greatly praised and became honored of the chapter. Furthermore, Mortarion preferred utilizing vast infantry units of heavily armored elites over vehicles, which, say Morty, same. He did this because he didn't want them to rely on vehicles in order for them to be more independent and adept in any war zone. As such, he equipped his Death Guard with the very best gear. This meant that the Death Guard were adept in fighting in nearly any conditions and were designed to be especially adaptable. Notably, rather than having specialized assault, tactical, and devastator squads, Mortarion taught his sons to be proficient with all weapons, allowing any Marine to forego their bolters in favor of other weapons if the situation called for it. All these came together to make the Death Guard the toughest legion and the favored pick for hazardous environment operations and close quarters combat. And during the Great Crusade, they would continue to be a relentless and formidable legion, enduring the harshest battles and emerging even stronger than ever. Also notably, Mortarion was shunned by basically all the Primarchs, both because he was a bitter asshole to most of them and was also a smelly weirdo. However, he did find friendship with fellow weirdo Conrad Kurz, and he became pals with Horus. Because of course, everyone loves Horus. Except for Korax. Also, notably, Mortarion absolutely hated Psykers, both because of the overlords of Barbarous being Psykers, and because of the atrocities he witnessed other Psykers inflicting on his legion and others. Plus, I don't think it's really stated officially, but I'm sure he further hates Psykers since powerful Psykers can pretty easily bypass even the heaviest physical armors and toughness. But anyways, eventually a little something called the Horus Heresy would happen, and Mortarion was actually quite hard to sway to Horus's side despite his strong relationship with the War Master. But Horus somehow gaslit Mortarion into believing that the Emperor was somehow more of a dirty Psyker than the literal gods of the warp. You know, the source of all Psyker energies. Jokes aside, though, Mortarion was actually convinced that the Emperor was not only a mega psyker, but also a mega tyrant like Nasser was. Plus, Mortarion still hated psykers, even aligned with Chaos, and refused any Chaos gifts. That was, of course, until he met up with his favorite son and known swell guy Typhon en route to Terra. For context, earlier in the Great Crusade, Typhon set on his own little crusade, which Mortarion found a bit suspicious, but allowed as he was Morty's bestest pal. And now, Mortarion called for him to reunite with the Legion so that they could fight at full strength. Upon meeting Typhon, he convinced Mortarion to ride to Terra with him on his cool little spaceship, the Terminus Est, instead of Mortarion's usual. And on board, Typhon accused the navigators of being double agents and had them all executed, promising that he could take their place in guiding the ship to Terra. But before that, Typhon allowed the Terminus Est to drift unprotected through the warp, and its passengers were soon inflicted with a super mega disease since they put their ship in warp holes and had no protection. The Death Guard were inflicted with the Destroyer Hive, which mutated the host, and this part is really freaking gross, so hold on to your butts. But the hive caused warp flies to lay eggs in the victims' orifices, bloat them up with the yuckies, and then burst with the birth of even more flies. In addition, they mutate horrific growths and their organs constantly burst and mend. All the while, the host is unable to die, doomed to endless torture as the Destroyer Hive cycle endlessly perpetuates. And with that yucky note, Typhon's treachery was revealed. Turns out when he was solo crusading, he discovered Chaos and he actually quite liked it. Which also, if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually pledged to Chaos even before Horus, which is kind of crazy. But anyways, he set a trap for his father in Legion, and it really bugged Mortarion, so the Primarch tried killing him for his betrayal. Typhon used his secret Psyker powers to put up a bit of a fight, but was inevitably outmatched by the Primarch. However, Typhon was also the host of the Destroyer Hive, and he quickly came back to life. Then, Mortarion unleashed his demon champion, Grulgor. Grulgor had pledged to Mortarion that he would kill Typhon, and he did it! Yippee! But again, Typhon obviously regenerated, and with the pledge fulfilled, the demon merged with Typhon, transforming him into the Herald of Nurgle, Typhus, Lord of Flies. Wait, that can't be right, that's a book. I meant host of the Destroyer Hive. And with Typhus more powerful than ever with the blessings of Nurgle, and Mortarion severely weakened by the Destroyer Hive, Morty got some PTSD flashbacks to Barbarous, suffering before his adoptive father, as well as flashbacks to the shame he felt before the Emperor. And along with the PTSD, he also got a nice side of Nurgle taunting him, saying that without his blessings, Mortarion and his sons would be forever doomed to the torture of the Destroyer Hive. So, faced with the option of flies in his ass forever or literally anything else, Mortarion willingly pledged himself to Nurgle. Yeah, Nurgle totally only takes in those willing to take his blessings, and he totally loves his followers. Oh, what a nice guy. Oh, thanks, buddy, old pal. I'm sure happy that you could help me with the urethra flies that you put there. Oh, I sure know when I'm loved. Thank you, Papa Nurgle. And the fat fuck didn't even have the decency to remove the flies. He just gaslit the Death Guard into being okay with it. Hey Nurgle, I have a present for you. It's the Cool Guy of the Year award. Shove it up your fat ass! But on a less insane note, there are some interesting parallels with this deal and the Emperor's deal on Barbarous. Both were essentially fake choices where poor old Morty was put in an impossible spot and eventually signed himself up to be the pawn of a tyrant that he despised. It's honestly pretty tragic since all the little guy ever wanted to be was a hero to himself, but he's constantly manipulated by forces greater than himself. But anyways, after being forced to accept Nurgle's blessings, Mortarion ascended to demonhood, and his Death Guard were turned into Plague Marines. Although ridden with never-ending grotesque diseases, the Plague Marines were more resilient than ever as a destroyer hive in Nurgle's powers gave them unparalleled toughness, regenerative abilities, and attrition. The Death Guard were now truly death incarnate and were an unstoppable force whose mere presence brought death and miasma. The Plague Marines are some of the most, if not the most terrifying foes to face as they horribly mutate and torture their enemies just by existing. It's like the ugly barnacle, except instead of everyone just dying, they suffer endlessly, die, and then worst of all, they have to work for Nurgle. And as time wore on, after the heresy had ended, the Death Guard had only gotten more and more powerful as their Nurgle blessings became more and more potent. So then, after the heresy and killing some worlds, Mortarion eventually kinda just settled down on his plague plan to study the warp further as he hates his current form and he still hates Psychers. And while he spends a lot of time on this planet, he's not completely complacent. His plague world is in a spot where it's easier for him to go to real space to conduct raids, and he's also trying to build up his legion to be absolutely humongously unstoppable. Which, also interestingly, the Death Guard, like the other legions, broke into smaller war bands, in their case called Vectorums, but unlike the others, they're still mostly loyal to either Mortarion or Typhus, meaning that they're one of the most unified Chaos forces and they hardly ever battle their battle brothers, unlike pretty much every other Chaos Legion. And in 40k, they're mostly up to the same stuff as before, being resilient, making new diseases, and being real smelly. Except now they've got some new toys. Most notably, they have Psychers now, baby! Morty be damned! Literally. Oh, well, sorry, Mortarion. But as for current events, Mortarion recently headed the Plague Wars, clashing with Gilliman and technically the Emperor, and Typhus leads a great plague fleet across the galaxy, sowing terror and disease everywhere he goes. Also, interestingly, Typhus is low-key probably more favored than Mortarion by Nurgle as he fully believes in the Chaos cause and is wholly devoted to Nurgle, unlike his more reluctant father and brothers. And other cultural development for the Death Guard are the Mantles of Corruption, in which a Marine can train in one of 7 specialties that I list here. This is pretty cool since it's counter to their pre-heresy ways of being generalists, as they now have some of the most specialists of all the legions. I also think that this may warrant its own video down the line, but my favorites are the Noxious Blightbringers because they just look totally badass and they ring their cute little bells. But anyways, that's the Death Guard, and they're pretty cool. I see why people like them, but they've never really been my jam. I don't really like their current aesthetic of tentacles and crane bellies either. I don't really get the tentacles and belly mouth thing. Is it really as simple as them having belly mouths because, oh, they're fat guys, or what? It just doesn't feel consistent with their whole thing of blight, rot, and entropy. They aren't fat because they like to eat Big Macs. They're bloated because their mutated flesh is literally bursting from their armor. I mean, above all else, though, I suppose it does look cool, so that's good enough of an explanation, but I don't know, I certainly prefer the bloated flesh, corroded armor, and oozing viscera. It fits their whole army of the undead and death theme. That being said, though, on a positive note, Mortarion's death look is really super cool, and the flies and bells are actually really cool thematic details. I also like that of all the legions, they're probably the least willing to join Chaos and mostly got forced into it by that asshole Typhus. But overall, I don't know, they're not my absolute least favorite legion, and Mortarion isn't my least favorite Primarch, but they're kind of near the bottom. Perhaps it's just my hatred for Nurgle leaking over, or maybe it's because I literally just think they're gross, which is obviously their whole thing, but if I'm spending tens of hours painting a mini, I'd definitely rather look at something prettier. As for Mortarion, I actually really like his story and tragedy, but I don't really like him as a character. His main character trait of being a bitter jerk just isn't really compelling to me, even if it does make sense and is a sympathetic motivation. He's still leagues better than Angron, though, and honestly more tragic in my opinion. Feel free to yell at me in the comments, I guess. Oh, and did I mention I really hate Nurgle? And you know what? I wish Gilliman would have just canonically killed him, just fucking killed him, full stop. I think that would have been really funny. Hi friends, I haven't made a dedicated Chaos video on the channel yet, so let's dust off some of these old magic books and break right into a crash course on the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons are best known for their potent Psyker abilities, as their Primarch, Magnus the Red, is one of the most powerful Psykers in the setting, if not the most powerful Psyker in the setting. These are some of the coolest and most unique Marines around. They're an army of dusty ghosts led by super powerful sorcerers with a sick-ass Egyptian flair. That's pretty wizard. The Thousand Sons were the Emperor's 15th Legion and were named the Thousand Sons by the Emperor since originally they only had, as their name suggests, 1,000 Marines at first, which was notably smaller than other legions. In some books, it's also hinted that the Emperor foresaw some of the many tragedies befall the Thousand Sons and named the Legion as so. And at first, the Legion did as legions do and helped in the Great Crusade, crusading and such. But they weren't really notable until a few years into the Crusade when they magically developed magical powers due to their gene seed. But it wasn't all thousand sunshine and rainbows. These Psyker abilities were a lot like drinking an entire case of Mountain Dew Baja Fresh. It's super cool and fun at first, but after a while it'll begin to twist you into a horrible mutant freak. And this was deemed a flesh change on account of it changing the sun's flesh, which honestly is a bit of an understatement in my opinion. Like, technically getting shot in the face and dying is also a flesh change, but you wouldn't call it that. But anyways, the Marines afflicted with the flesh change were put into stasis chambers in hopes of the Imperium finding a cure soon. Although many felt it had changed, the Marines who didn't became extremely powerful Psykers and some of the most powerful single Marines. And eventually the Emperor and the Thousand Sons found the Legion's Primarch Magnus the Red on the remote planet of Prospero. Once the Emperor left Prospero, however, the entirety of the Thousand Sons Legion was suddenly affected by the flesh change and would be doomed if not for their gene father Magnus. Magnus tried everything in his power to help his sons, but was initially unsuccessful. Eventually, though, in his desperation, Magnus unknowingly made a deal with Tzeentch, losing his eye and much more in exchange for stabilizing the 15th Legion's gene seed. And all I gotta say is, maybe you should have learned to play the fiddle harder, idiot. And also, one on the Magnus wrong counter, please. Although the change was seemingly cured, only 1,000 sons survived the whole ordeal. Wait, holy crap, 1,000 sons? That's like their name! Wow! From then, they continued their crusade under Magnus and slowly rebuilt their numbers. And they were a powerful force despite their low numbers due to the Legion boasting the most powerful Psykers of all the Legions. Despite the power of the Psykers, as the crusade went, the imperial condemnation of the use of warp energy and sorcery became more and more pressing, eventually culminating in the Council of Nicaea. The council resulted in the Emperor declaring that no Space Marine chapter was allowed to use Psyker powers. And this was obviously a big drag on the Legion known for using their Psyker powers, and the Sons exiled themselves on Prospero. On Prospero, Magnus foresaw Horus becoming Horus Heresy, and he tried to convince Horus not to betray the Imperium. However, unfortunately, Magnus is from Prospero, not Persuadero, so his attempts failed and he decided he needed to warn the Emperor of the heresy on the horizon. And this next part's going to need some context. So, one of the Emperor's primary goals during the Great Crusade was called the Webway Project, in which he hoped to emulate the Old One's Webway, which would significantly limit humanity's reliance on the warp, since going through the warp is the only faster than light travel that the Imperium has access to, and using the Webway is a lot safer than using Geller fields and navigators. But what's a webway? Well, in simple terms, the webway is basically just a bunch of tunnels through the warp that are protected from the horrors of the Immaterium with powerful psychic shields. And in case you don't know, the warp, or the Immaterium as it's sometimes called, is basically just like space hell. So, now with that in mind, Magnus, instead of calling an astropath, flying to Terra personally, or literally anything else, he decides to use his match to astral project himself to the Emperor and tell of Horus's treachery. And this would be fine and dandy, but on his astral way to the Emperor, he saw this big psychic webway wall, and Magnus said, "Oh boy, a shortcut! Let me just use this real quick and get to the Emperor sooner." And he tried to break the wall, but he failed. Luckily, some kind, mysterious stranger whose likely in no way sinister at all, offer to help Magnus. And Magnus, believing himself to be a total master of the warp, blindly accepted the offer, or I suppose I should say, half blindly accepted it. And with their combined might, he blasted through the wall, consequently letting a horde of demons and horrors assault the webway and completely ruin the Emperor's webway project. And can we put another big one on the Magnus wrong counter, please? And for this, the Emperor banished Magnus's astral form from him and sent the Space Wolves to bring Magnus back to Terra for some punishment. Magnus was deeply ashamed, willing to accept any punishment the Emperor had in mind for him, and he went into depression mode. He cried in his Prospero house, and he ordered his legion to lay down all their defenses. However, Horus did a little bit of heresying and convinced Lehman Russ to try and kill Magnus instead of arresting him, and this led to the burning of Prospero, where the Space Wolves massacred the unprepared Thousand Sons and razed the planet's cities to the ground. Seeing his sons in peril, Magnus receded on his willing to accept any punishment and went to fight the Space Wolves. Lehman Russ and Magnus had a monstrous battle in which both Primarchs were severely beaten, but Russ ultimately came out on top and broke Magnus's back, and Magnus used the last of his power to transport the remaining Thousand Sons to a different planet. From there, Magnus made another deal with Tzeentch. You know, the dude who was the cause of literally all of the problems in Magnus's life. Magnus wrong counter, take us to 3. Except multiply it by 9 for Tzeentch and then add on a point for every time Magnus was stupid, arrogant, or both. And that should bring us to approximately 1,018 wrong points for the Crimson King. And after the burning of Prospero, only about 1,000 Thousand Sons remained. Holy crap, 1,000 sons? That's like their name! Wow! But after teleporting his sons to the planet of the sorcerers, Magnus was shattered into a bunch of shards representing core traits of him. His legion set out to collect these shards to rebuild their Primarch. Eventually, they got most of the shards, and the only significant missing one was the nobility of Magnus. The Thousand Sons and Magnus really wanted this shard as it was the single strongest shard, and would return Magnus to his pre-shatter state. But it was fused with the first Grey Knight Supreme Grand Master Janus by Malkador the Sigillite. However, even without this shard, the Thousand Sons got enough pieces to stabilize Magnus and form the shard known as the Crimson King, who takes the form of Demon Prince Magnus. From there, the Thousand Sons allied themselves with Horus, helped out in the Siege of Terra, and eventually dedicated themselves to Tzeentch. Cause, you know, if Tzeentch is going to control all aspects of your life, you'd might as well act like you want him to. But, as always, partnering with the Chaos God is bound to have chaotic consequences. Who would have guessed? And the Thousand Sons were once again afflicted with the flesh change, this time even worse than before. To save the Legion this time, Ahriman and his conclave of elite sorcerers cast a Rubric of Ahriman. It did indeed save the Legion, but it also cursed the bulk of them to become mindless Rubric Marines, basically dust ghosts that are bound to their armor. However, the Rubric Marines are incredibly durable and hard to kill at the cost of their speed and autonomy, and the ones who didn't become dust had their psychic powers amplified. This makes for a pretty powerful fighting force as the powerful sorcerers lead legions of nearly unkillable and completely obedient automatons. So, I guess you win some, you dim some. Except not in Magnus's eyes. Magnus banished Ahriman and his friends from the planet of sorcerers, and now Ahriman roams the galaxy trying to increase his power and has been trying to get into the Eldar's Black Library to perhaps reverse the rubric. But despite the apparent failure of Ahriman, the Thousand Sons after the heresy were still a formidable force, and their last operation as a unified legion was a battle of the Fang, where they tried to enact their revenge on the Space Wolves by sieging Fenris. Fenris did ward off the sorcerers, but it took heavy losses. And that's a video for another day, though, and the Thousand Sons and Wolves continue to have a fierce rivalry to this day. Speaking of to this day, in the current setting, the Thousand Sons have arranged themselves into 9 cults and do the bidding of Tzeentch. For a while, the Primarch rarely went into the Materium, the real world outside of the warp, but in most recent times, he has been helping Abaddon, he fought Gilliman, and he's been basically doing whatever else he can do to get his vengeance and watch the galaxy burn in warp fire. Since their founding, the Thousand Sons have always had an insatiable thirst for knowledge and sought out ways to hone their magical abilities. This led to a culture of scholars and ambitious Marines always seeking any and all knowledge. Nerds! However, this also caused them to, much like their Primarch, act arrogantly and foolhardy at times, as they often overestimated their own power and underestimated the consequences of their failures, which could honestly be the tagline of the Thousand Sons. And after turning to Chaos, the Thousand Sons also utilize cultists to gather artifacts for them. The Thousand Sons will often get summoned by a cult and then just steal the cult's artifacts and peace out, which honestly, that's kind of based. But sometimes, if a cult psyker proved to be especially powerful, they may be taken by the Legion, get pumped full of warp energies as a test, and if they happen to survive, they're made into an aspiring Astarte sorcerer. Oh, and let's not forget their obvious ancient Egyptian aesthetic influences. Obviously, their armor, but they also have pyramids on Prospero, and some of their weapons are Egyptian, like their Kopesh. I've also heard that Thousand Sons have a lot of Persian influences, but I'm no history expert, so I can't really speak on the culture much. But yeah, super cool stuff. Thousand Sons are a very unique legion, and Magnus, albeit a constant wrongdoer, is a very interesting character. They're described as a legion of ghosts led by the damned, and that's metal as hell. Plus, wizards, demons, and ghosts make for a super cool army. But let me know what you think of the Thousand Sons. Do you like them? Did Magnus do anything wrong? Yes. And what Chaos Legion is better than them and deserve to be the first Chaos Legion covered on the channel? Let me know in the comments below. I also like the Thousand Sons because I won a painting competition with a sorcerer I painted, so that's pretty cool. Wow, now that certainly was chaotic. I get it. Yeah, well, you know what? I don't have to write good jokes. 90% of you are probably sleeping or watching a new video by now. So, yeah, thanks for watching. And of course, thank you to my awesome Patreons. And as always, please like, comment, subscribe, and consider sharing to all your big five Chaos Legions. Thanks.